In this video I'm going to be replacing the main front rubber grip on a Panasonic Lumix GH5. This GH5 has obviously seen better days. The rubber on the front grip has a big hole in the top and it's coming away from the camera body, which is a very common problem with the GH5. So in this video I'm going to be replacing it. The replacement part is from AliExpress and it cost me about €14. This repair is quite a complicated process since to access the screws holding the front grip in place means almost completely disassembling the camera right down to removing the motherboard. Whenever you take something apart there's always a risk of damaging it, so I'd recommend just watching the video through at least once before attempting this to see if it's something you'd feel confident doing. With that said, let's get on with the repair. The first step is to remove any memory cards and then turn the camera over, open the battery door and remove the battery. Now slide the eye cup upwards from the bottom and remove it from the camera. Behind the eye cup you'll see two screws, indicated here by the red circles. These need to be removed next. Now turn the camera over so that the bottom plate is facing you and remove these three screws closest to the LCD screen. Next we need to remove the battery door, and to do that these two screws need to be removed and then the battery door can be lifted off and put to one side. Now on the right side of the camera by the memory card slots, remove these two screws. Then on the other side of the camera below the mic port, remove this screw at the top. Finally, there's a single screw hidden away here in the bottom of the battery compartment. This screw can be a little tricky to remove due to a lack of space. I found it helpful to wrap a rubber band around the top of the screwdriver for some extra grip. Now, with all of the screws gone, it's time to open up the camera. Insert a plastic pry tool into the gap between the front and back case, beginning here near the tripod mount. Then insert another pry tool on the other side, being careful not to insert it too far to avoid damaging the flex cables underneath. Lever the pry tool outwards to create a little gap between the front and back case. Then use another pry tool on the side, levering it outwards to create a gap, and then again on the top. Once you've created a gap around all of the edges, slowly and carefully begin separating the two halves of the camera. You can't separate the two parts completely yet as there are still these two flex cables connecting the motherboard to the back. To release them, use a nylon spudger or your fingernail to lift up the retaining flap on the back of the socket, and then you can slide the cable straight back out of the connector parallel to the board. Then do the same with the second flex cable. Now you can lift the back of the camera up and away from the front. Now that we can see the GH5 motherboard, we've got a total of 12 cables to disconnect before the motherboard can be removed. Starting with this cable at the top left, lift up the locking flap and then use a piece of electrical tape as a pull tab to slide the cable backwards out of the connector parallel to the board. For the cable next to it, secure the socket with your thumb and use your other thumb and index finger to slide the cable straight back out of the socket. For the next cable, lift up the flap, insert a spudger under the loop and use it to slide the cable straight back. Now for this curved cable, you can lift up the flap and then just use your finger to slide the cable back out of the socket. For the cable underneath, lift up the flap, then use a piece of tape as a pull tab to slide the cable back. Now moving down to the bottom side of the board, starting with the largest flex cable, Lift up the locking flap with your fingernail and then slide the cable back with your finger. And the same with the cable to the left. Lift up the flap, then slide the cable backwards out of the socket. There isn't a lot of slack on these next two cables to pull them out. I found it easiest to use the tip of a spudger or some tweezers to gradually walk the cables back out of the sockets after flipping up the locking flaps. And with the small cable on the bottom left, there's no retaining flap here, but again you can just slowly walk the cable back out of its socket with some tweezers or the pointed end of a spudger. Now, hidden away under the large flex cable at the bottom, there are two more flex cables. With the larger one, you can just flip up the retaining flap and then use a piece of tape as a pull tab to remove the cable from the socket. And then the smaller cable can be gradually walked back out of its socket with some tweezers. And that's it, all the cables have been disconnected. Now we just have to remove these 4 screws that are securing the motherboard. With those screws gone, you can lift up the motherboard from the right, being careful not to catch on any of the flex cables, and lift it out of the camera. Next we need to remove the battery bay. Start by removing this screw on the plastic spacer. Now you can lift up the plastic spacer, revealing the PCB underneath. To remove the PCB, we need to remove this screw on the right. Now you can lift out the PCB. Finally, the metal cover on the battery bay has to come out as well. It's held in place with 2 screws. Start by removing this screw on the left. Now the second screw is over here on the side. Now you can unclip the metal cover at the top on the right and lift it out of the camera. Now finally we have access to the 2 screws holding on the front grip. Before the grip can be removed, we have to take out these 2 final screws at the bottom of the camera. Now the front grip can be lifted off the camera. Before installing the new grip, I'm just going to give the area underneath a quick clean with a cotton pad dampened in isopropyl alcohol to clean off the dirt and grime that's accumulated under there over the years. Once everything's nice and clean, it's time to get the new grip installed. If you look at the new part, you'll see 3 plastic tabs on one side. These tabs fit inside these 3 cutouts on the camera body. Put the new grip onto the camera and slide it right until it clicks into place. Now we can start putting the camera back together. Begin by replacing these 2 screws on the bottom. Now turn the camera over and replace these 2 screws on the back to hold the grip in place. Now replace the metal cover on the battery bay and replace the 2 screws to secure it, starting with the one on the right and then the one on the front. You'll see 2 holes on the corners of the battery PCB. These holes fit over these 2 plastic posts on the camera shell. Drop the PCB into place and then replace this single screw to secure it. Now you can replace the plastic cover over the top and replace this screw in the bottom left corner. Now replace the motherboard, being careful not to trap any of the flex cables underneath. Make sure that the 2 holes on the right corners of the motherboard sit over these 2 plastic posts on the camera shell. Now replace these 4 screws to hold the motherboard in place. Now it's time to go around the board and reattach all of these cables. Begin with this small cable at the top, which can just be pushed straight back into its socket parallel to the board. The flex cable next to it can be lined up with the connector using your fingers and can then be pushed into place using some tweezers or a spudger. Once it's fully seated, you can close the retaining flap. You'll know when the cables are fully seated when the top edge of the ears on the end of the cable are level with these lines printed on the PCB underneath. With the next cable, again line it up with the socket, use tweezers to gently work it back into the connector until it's fully seated, and then close the retaining flap. Do the same with the next flex cable, line it up, fully seat it using tweezers or a spudger, and then close the flap. Then reattach the curved flex cable over the top. Now moving down to the bottom of the motherboard, the smaller flex cable doesn't have a retaining flap, so you can just line it up with your fingers and then gradually walk it back into the socket using tweezers. For the cable next to it, line it up and then use a piece of tape as a pull tab to fully seat it in the connector and then close the retaining flap. Then replace the large flex cable over the top, again using a piece of tape as a pull tab, then closing the retaining flap. The next cable can be gently walked back into the connector with some tweezers and then close the flap to hold it in place. And the same again with the next cable. Make sure the flap is in the raised position, line the cable up, gradually walk it back into the connector until it's fully seated and then close the flap. Do the same with the next cable. And then we've just got one small cable left. Again, this cable has no retaining flap, so it can just be walked back into the connector using some tweezers until it's fully seated. Now it's time to put the two halves of the camera back together again. Reattach the two flex cables between the back of the camera and the motherboard. Starting with the lower one, line up the cable with the connector, slide it back into place with your finger and then close the flap. Then do the same with the other cable, making sure that the retaining flap is in the raised position. Use your finger to slide the cable into the connector and then close the flap. Now you can lower the back of the camera back onto the front and slowly push the two halves of the camera back together. Go around each edge, pressing the two parts together to close all of the gaps. Once you're satisfied that the camera is completely closed, turn it upside down and we can replace the battery door. Put the door back into place and close the lever while holding the hinge in place with your thumb. And replace the two screws to hold the battery door in place. Now, just before replacing the outer case screws, I want to check that the camera is working. So I'm going to put in a memory card, insert a battery and then turn the camera on. Test all of the buttons and dials to make sure that they're working. If you find one that isn't working, don't panic, it's probably just a flex cable that wasn't inserted all the way. So just open up the camera again and check all of the cables. Once you're satisfied that everything's working, it's time to replace the remaining screws. First, these three screws below the LCD screen. Next, replace this screw at the bottom to the right of the memory card slot. And then this screw above the memory card slot. Now turn the camera around and replace this screw below the microphone port. Next, replace the two long screws either side of the viewfinder. With those screws replaced, you can now slide the eye cup back into place over the top. And finally, we just need to replace this last screw inside the battery compartment. And that's it, we're finally done. I hope this video helped if this is a repair you need to do yourself. That's it for now, thanks for watching.